we are talking about the Charter and the quest for equality with Edgar Pieterse, Director of the African Center for Cities, Joan Bouchard from the Observatory for Cultural Rights and Diversity, and Tere Badia, Secretary General of Cultural Action Europe. They will give you 3 different points of view from their different studies and knowledge on the quest for equality starting from the Charter. So let's start with Edgar. Morning, Edgar.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. So I want to first off congratulate the City of Rome and UCLG on this very important initiative, and having now applied my mind to the Charter this week in preparing for today, I'm convinced that it can be a catalyst for a much more ambitious and impactful movement for cultural democracy. Now, we've been asked to reflect on the relationship between the Charter and questions of equality. And I guess the real question is, how do we understand and confront inequality, which of course is the big barrier to achieving greater equality. Now, given the constraints of time and also optimizing the opportunity to consider the Charter in relation to very diverse contexts in the world, I've decided to stick close to home and, if you will, reflect on this question from the perspective of Cape Town and South Africa. And in some ways, Cape Town is almost the metaphor. It's the emblematic example of urban inequality and the complexity of the challenges. And hopefully, by being parochial, I am also able to reflect on a set of issues that might have relevance and resonance for other cities. Now, of course, it's important to start off by reminding ourselves that inequality has got a multiplicity of dimensions. The most important, and especially in an extractive capitalist system, is of course the economic aspect, and that splits between income inequality, which is what's normally measured with a Gini coefficient measure. But actually the real issue is wealth inequality, is the inequality in assets. And if you take a country like South Africa, where the white population is only 9% of the total population, that group accounts for 95% of asset ownership in the South African society, 25 years after democratization. So it just gives one some sense of the intractability of the economic inequality question. But of course, economic inequality cannot operate or be reproduced without social cultural inequality. And again, in the post-colonial environment, we have to understand that this manifests in a racialization that is a product of the colonial legacy and inheritance. And at the heart of that sits a very deep mindset that manifests systemically in an obsession with hierarchies. So there's hierarchies that's reflected in questions of racial relations, ethnicities, genders, tradition versus modernity, and so forth. And so this hierarchical mindset and disposition, and if you will, reflex in our social institutions, are of course normalized through religion, through our schooling system, family norms, and so forth. But most insidiously in 2020, it's the media and the profound impacts of social media in particular. Now, to bring this back to the Charter of Rome and to Cape Town, what we've witnessed is an exacerbation of these different dimensions of inequality in space. And so you find in most of our cities in the world a profound concentration, or if you will, agglomeration of these multiple dimensions of inequality. And so you get these significant enclaves of multiple disadvantage. And of course, this, and you know, to not be too instrumental about this, this produces its own cultures, of course. And you know, if we, for example, think of one of the most important strands of cultural vitality in the world, of course, it's hip hop. And hip hop is a direct manifestation of a negotiation of precisely these forms of extreme spatial concentration, intermeshed with very particular understandings of Black masculinity. Now, Cape Town itself is not just plagued by COVID-19 as everywhere else, recently a drought, but most perniciously by an epidemic of social violence. So Cape Town is the 8th most violent city in the world by the last survey that tracks these things. But it's not just gang-related violence. A more insidious form of social violence is gender-based violence. And so we've got an absolute epidemic of rape culture, of incest, and so forth. And all of these things can in some ways be connected to questions of maladjusted masculinities. And this is particularly acute in the complexities that surround Black masculinities. Now, for us to solve this, of course, is an incredibly complicated and very, very dense problematic, and there's no way that I can address this in a short talk of this nature. But what I want to focus on is one dimension that contributes to this, and that is how the city of Cape Town has managed to endure a colonial inflection by not just ignoring, but actively suppressing a very important cultural tradition, which is called in isiXhosa, ulwaluko. And this is the practice of initiation, where young boys become men through a 6-week period of isolation, which is all about endurance, about testing endurance. Now, this is, of course, a tradition that was born in the rural areas, and it was typically associated with people, young men, young boys going into the wild and having elders as custodians. And through this ritual, they emerge on the other side after circumcision as men. Now, this practice is still absolutely widely practiced within the urban context. But what has happened is that a community that just 25 years ago was only 28% of the city's population, today is 40% of the city's population, have no formal recognition from the state to fulfill this practice, right? And so they've got to seek out incredibly exposed interstices in the city to perform an absolutely vital, necessary, essential ritual that is at the heart of a particular understanding of Xhosa identity. Now, I draw attention to this because it reminds us that even though a city like Cape Town, very modern, signed up to the Resilient Cities Charter, to the New Urban Agenda, to every conceivable progressive sounding framework you can imagine, in the routine functioning of the city, because culture is rendered invisible, and it is rendered through a very particular Eurocentric lens as to what constitutes creativity, what constitutes vitality, and so forth. The very people in the city and the very cultural fabric that gives life and animation and a sense of history and a sense of place, sense of belonging, a sense of aspiration, those very things, that is the most uppermost things, is completely suppressed. Because the framework of culture that is applied is one that has a very particular set of cultural norms and values that assumes certain kinds of culture is valid, certain kinds of culture needs to be valorized, and certain kinds of culture can provide the bridge into a form of global consumerism that is regarded as hip and creative and so forth and so forth. Now, coming back to the Charter, can the Charter of Rome help me in my critique, help us in our problematic of extreme cultural erasure and exclusion in Cape Town? And so we then have to remind ourselves that if we want to confront inequality, one of these structural dimensions, we've got to recognize that this demands awareness, and that's of course a societal task. It demands understanding, it demands outrage, as you can hear from my tone, it demands rage, strategic clarity and determination about what the structural drivers are and how to upend them. It demands confrontation across lines of difference in the city. And I guess most difficult, it demands engagement, which is the only way in which one can begin to remake and do things differently. And so the previous presentation by the collective from Rome about the orchestra is a beautiful illustration, I think, of the kinds of processes that we need to begin to normalize in our cities and invest in. But if we want to think of scale and not just have these very cute conversations with the in crowd that kind of can speak the lingo of cultural policy, understand creative cities, et cetera, but really impact on the city, we've got to always think through what does this mean for transforming the education system in the city. Everything from early childhood development all the way through lifelong learning for people in factories and firms and so forth. Because unless we are able to embed these processes and what we learn from them within a larger learning culture within our cities, we can't do this. But I'm convinced looking through the 5 key lenses of the Charter: discovery, enjoyment, creation, sharing, protection, that this is a beautiful set of registers to, for example, imagine a process where we can bring together the elders in the city, bring together other custodians of transitions into adulthood from other communities, bring together artists, bring together writers, bring together historians, landscape architects, and so forth. And let's build a living museum of the history of erasure of initiation in Cape Town, right? As a project for the city. For me, if we do something like that, that as kind of a way of exploring what the Charter of Rome might mean for Cape Town, we will begin to activate the catalytic and the transformative power of what we're talking about. Because ultimately, if these processes don't clarify for cities and across lines of difference, and for the elites in particular, demands of restitution and healing, we are going to end up with processes where the cultural sort of collectives or communities only speak to themselves and have no impact on the systemic drivers of inequalities in our cities. So on that note, I just want to conclude by saying that I'm very inspired by the possibility of what a charter like this can activate, can open up. And I'm really hoping that through this kind of engagement, in the sort of looking back at the example that I was reflecting on today, that the various dimensions of Black and Indigenous cultural identities and life, and especially the histories that remain suppressed, that remain hidden, that remain ignored, and fundamentally delegitimized, that we can begin to use these mechanisms to open up different conversations. And I sincerely hope that my political leaders in the city of Cape Town, in the metropolitan government, will also say, yes, this is another global initiative that we will embrace, but that we can then use that as a basis to begin to have some of the substantive, difficult, painful debates that this city so desperately needs if we are going to get serious about inequality. Thank you very much.